Global warming is the debate that never was. It hit the news headlines 20 years ago, was never really questioned, and we've been spammed by it ever since. With the rapid decline in regular church-going, our innate desire for spirituality can find a home in the new church, the Church of Global Warming. This church tells us we are destroying the planet by our consumerist greed. It plays on the classic guilt complex. We crave too many goodies in life and, to get them, are burning too many fossil fuels. This releases CO2 into the atmosphere, which acts as a greenhouse gas, and this is overheating the planet. Stop consuming, save the planet. A powerful message indeed, and if true, we should listen to. But whether it's true or not is the big question. The Church of Global Warming believes that man-made global warming is gospel. However, every large-scale church always has its heretics. One of the more vocal heretics, or should I say skeptics, over the years to the CO2 argument has been Václav Klaus. He lived under repressive communism, survived it, and is a famous freethinker who has risen to the presidency of the European Union. He sees ambitious environmentalism as the new communism. It is an ideology that aims to replace the free and spontaneous evolution of mankind by a sort of central, now global planning.
It is not about climatology. It's about freedom.
Whether you agree that the true aim of the Church of Global Warming is control, or is it genuine concern for the environment is up to you. However, the Church is requesting massive worldwide economic restrictions on trade and energy production. And this definitely requires centralized global planning of human development. That's why, motives aside, we really have to question the need for it and analyze what the consequences will be. Is man-made, also known as anthropogenic, CO2 the primary cause of the global warming we've seen since the Industrial Revolution? Firstly, we aim to examine the science behind anthropogenic global warming. Secondly, we also aim to discuss something that has been perhaps more crucial in the science, sadly, in this debate, the politics. In addition, we will delve into the social and economic costs of action, or alternatively, inaction. We've been spammed by the press telling us of the disaster that awaits us. The planet is dying. Do something. Well, what do you expect? Bold headlines and fear-mongering sells. The less interesting viewpoint, that imminent global environmental disaster does not await us, is somewhat less interesting, not so newsworthy. The wide-ranging debate that we rarely see in our mainstream press is, however, raging underground on the web. This presentation tries to condense as much of it as possible into, hopefully, a palatable form. Global warming is a hot and contentious topic. The field of study is massive, and so are the number of data sources that are cited. One could argue, till the cows come home, the relative reliability of each. Thus, where possible, we use the least controversial, most universally acceptable form. For instance, when given the choice between satellite and surface temperature records, we chose the latter, as it is the preferred source by those who believe in CO2-based global warming. However, with that said, the conclusions drawn from analyses of these data sets may be a tad more controversial. So, what is global warming, and why should it be linked to CO2? Good question. In this case, global warming can be defined as the unnatural warming up of the planet as a whole due to increased greenhouse gases, in particular, man-made carbon dioxide. The greenhouse effect in itself is not harmful, far from it. It makes Earth the habitable place it is, by warming it up by about 30 degrees. CO2 is one of the many greenhouse gases involved in this warming, with water being the most important. Instead of the sun's rays just hitting the Earth's surface and bouncing straight out back into space, the atmospheric gases and clouds absorb, then reemit them back to the surface again, increasing the temperature. Without greenhouse gases, man, and life as we know it, would not exist. They in themselves are not a bad thing. So what is all the fuss about? If greenhouse gases are essential for man's survival, why does having a few more create a cause for concern? Well, Sir John Houghton, one of the most important scientists involved in discovering this threat, describes it dramatically as follows. The impacts of global warming are such that I have no hesitation describing it as a weapon of mass destruction.
And we really have to take action, and we have to take it as fast as we can.
Under his leadership of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, we first heard of the global catastrophe we're digging ourselves into. The influential IPCC are the leading international authority in the global warming movement, and have the ear of the majority of the world's leaders. Paralleling the rhetoric of George Bush, Sir John Houghton said global warming is a weapon of mass destruction. Well, it could possibly affect us in a number of ways. There will be, and perhaps we are already seeing, severe droughts alongside severe storms. The melting of the ice caps will lead to flooding of low-lying areas, as perhaps we've seen already by Hurricane Katrina. In addition, deadly tropical diseases such as malaria will spread further afield to currently cooler climes. To understand global warming, you need to understand its history. The origin of global warming was politically motivated. That in itself does not mean it's incorrect, but it does help explain why the majority of politicians around the world, those who we generally trust to lead us well, believe in it.
We're determined to be part of the solution to climate change.
To move along a climate change agenda. We have got to persuade people around the world to change their behaviour as well.
Every scientist all across the world have determined that the climate is changing.
Who are we to disagree with them? Well, if you see it as really an issue of energy security, not of impending global meltdown, then you can see why our politicians are happy to toe the party line. Up until the 1980s, the world's scientists were ablaze with talk of the upcoming catastrophe that was the Ice Age. A frozen world is a dead world, far more than a gloriously balmy, warm one. Maggie Thatcher became Britain's Prime Minister in her own blaze of catastrophes. The massive mining industry had collapsed. The miners were on strike and had ousted her predecessor from power. And OPEC quadrupled the price of oil overnight.
The strikers, Scottish miners reinforced by men from North East England and Yorkshire, withdrew, regrouped and countercharged. There followed some of the most violent clashes on the picket lines in Scotland for some weeks.
With cheap coal and oil a thing of the past, how could we safeguard our energy supplies?
The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices so that we do not live at the expense of future generations.
In comes the intensely unpopular but necessary prospect of nuclear power. In a bizarre twist of fate, a Faustian pact was made between the far right, Maggie the Iron Maiden, and the far left, the extreme environmentalists. If CO2, created by burning fossil fuels, was bad, then the British people would have to agree to the disagreeable, nuclear power.
No generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease.
Maggie Thatcher forked up the money for the Meteorological Society, MET, to prove to the world that CO2 was bad, and her arch political enemies on the left were ready to back her. So the IPCC was set up under political motives. Is its science, however, impartial now, or do these motives still cloud its findings?
Anyway, I would like to acknowledge the fact that I'm only a symbol of a much larger organization, the IPCC, and it's really the scientific community that contributes to the work of the IPCC and the governments.
The IPCC has always claimed it represents the vast majority of the world's leading climate scientists. Its views are open, bipartisan, and universally agreed. However, if you look at their makeup, you may have cause to question this. The lead authors select their own teams from like-minded scientists that they have co-authored with. They rarely seek input from those of an opposing viewpoint. 2/3 of the 53 authors of the key IPCC report chapter 9 belong to a small clique of co-authors. How much were the views of the 700 other leading scientists as listed by the US Senate, who are climate skeptics, included in this report? Whether you believe in CO2-driven global warming or not, it is not fair to say that most scientists are believers. There is no consensus, and even if there was, that means little. Science is based on evidence, not weight of numbers. So let's look at the evidence. I will now examine what Sir John Houghton and the rest of the IPCC have to say for man-made global warming. I will put forward their evidence and then discuss what others have said on the matter. It's up to you to decide what you want to believe, but be mindful that in many ways, the onus is on the global warming lobby to prove to you that CO2 is the main driver. Global warming, or cooling as it may be, is a normal, natural state of affairs. It can be explained by many other well-documented forces. So to claim the latest climate changes are due to man-made CO2 is just one option, and the burden of proof is on them. Famously, in the movie An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore showed us the results of looking at the last 400,000 years of ice core data. Ice contains a historical record of atmospheric conditions. As layers and layers of ice deposit in the polar regions, isotopes and air bubbles are trapped. These can then be analysed to deduce possible temperature and CO2 conditions through time.
By analysing the record of the climate from the bottom of the core to the top, we'll be able to see how we moved from a cold period into a warm period.
Al Gore demonstrated to us that CO2 and temperature levels tracked each other over time, and he claimed this implied CO2 drove temperature changes. However, almost universally, climatologists have debunked this implication. They now agree that CO2 lags temperature by 800 years, that lags temperature, and thus is not cause but effect. So, CO2 changes lag temperature changes. In response to this evidence, the CO2 lobby claimed that CO2 may indeed be secondary, but its greenhouse effect is then a positive feedback. In other words, it may not start a temperature change, but it makes any change much more severe. CO2 is a minor greenhouse gas. Water, in the form of vapor and cloud droplets, contributes to 90% of the greenhouse warming, not CO2. In addition, we humans only contribute to maximum a quarter of the CO2 in the atmosphere. Thus, our direct influence, agreed by most scientists, can only be 2.5%. However, this figure is not enough to explain the 0.7 degrees, perhaps, of global warming seen over the last century. Thus, our climate models use a multiplier of 2.5 on CO2's influence to balance the scales. The existence of this hypothetical positive feedback, or multiplier, is the crux of the matter. Without it, CO2-driven global warming cannot exist. Whether CO2 provides a positive feedback on the climate is highly contentious. Does it act as a multiplier, and if so, how? The proposed mechanism is as follows. Increased CO2 would lead to a slight increased air temperature, which would then lead to increased evaporation of water, especially from the tropical oceans. This evaporation will lead to more clouds in the sky, and thus further warming because this layer of water droplets can have a strong greenhouse effect. So, the multiplier occurs because CO2 emissions not only add to the CO2 greenhouse effect, but also trigger further warming by the water greenhouse effect. In principle, this positive feedback loop, which justifies a 2.5 multiplier, seems plausible. However, if you look at the actual available physical evidence, we don't see this phenomenon happening. If anything, the climate tends to revert to its previous equilibrium after a warming event. Luckily for us, negative feedback mechanisms prevail. This in many ways makes logical sense, because if the slightest change to the planet's equilibrium resulted in dramatic changes, the climate would be constantly going out of control, and it would be a very inhospitable place for us. Ice core data shows us that increasing temperature trends change to decreasing ones, while CO2 levels are still high. Surely this reversal would not be possible with significant CO2 feedbacks dominating. Without these hypothetical feedbacks, CO2 as a driver of global warming is out of the running in the greenhouse effect race. Most agree that a massive doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere can only lead to a 1 degree increase in temperature. This is because CO2 is already saturated in the atmosphere and can't increase its effect much more, irrespective of how much more is added. It may be true that man has elevated atmospheric CO2 by as much as 25% above natural base levels. However, the actual greenhouse effect this directly produces is universally agreed as minimal. The danger to our environment comes if you believe there are secondary, positive feedback mechanisms. Can increased CO2 levels trigger a tipping point, out of control warming? Both historical records and observed physical evidence for this hypothesis is scant, and these mechanisms look unlikely. So why are we worried about catastrophic global warming? Where is the evidence? Well, the evidence is embedded in non-transparent, elusive climate models. Modern climate models are relatively complex, and their creators claim they are back-tested and cross-referenced with 30 or so other groups around the world. Agreed, they probably cross-reference well, but that is largely meaningless. Two wrongs do not make a right, and their backtest performance quality, as we'll see, is very questionable. In addition, the climate model champions themselves, the IPCC, admit there are inherent limitations in computer models, and specifically the cloud feedback effects, which is a hugely significant component. Modelers claim that CO2 is the major forcing driver in global warming. Well, considering that this hypothesis is an input to the model, it's not surprising it comes out at the other end of the model as an output. This is not a robust way to go about modeling a system. The climate is hugely complex. We can't accurately model it currently. We can hardly predict the weather for the next week, let alone the next century. So, we currently have to take them with a large pinch of salt. The 2.5 multiplier effect of CO2 is a crucial assumption in climate models to predict catastrophic global warming. The observed evidence affirming this is currently quite unconvincing. But do they, at least as they claim, tie up with actual historical trends? In other words, do they backtest well? The sensitivity of the climate to CO2 is described by the IPCC as having two parts: the normal greenhouse effect and the slightly more controversial positive feedback effect. The former is universally acknowledged and the latter is somewhat controversial. So, looking at historical temperatures, can we observe the existence of the controversial feedback multiplier? Well, in the last 100 years, the actual global temperature increase was about 0.6-0.7 degrees. Even if you claim it is solely due to CO2, this can wholly be attributed to the normal greenhouse effect of CO2. No multiplier is required. So, at most, you could claim that global warming is due to CO2. But it is not, however, on a catastrophic trajectory. The IPCC do, however, predict a catastrophic trajectory of a temperature increase of 3.4 degrees by 2100. This requires the 2.5 multiplier. However, if you extrapolate backwards over the past 100 years, this multiplier would have required a 1.4 degree temperature increase. This didn't happen, and thus the IPCC multiplier does not backtest too well. The IPCC response to this dilemma is that they say global temperature is being masked by another byproduct of fossil fuel burning, namely sulfate aerosols. They have an overall cooling effect because they prevent incoming solar rays from reaching the Earth's surface. However, this is a very debatable effect, as sulfates are short-lived and localized. Most sulfates are released in the industrial northern hemisphere, but most global warming is also seen there. Shouldn't it be the opposite way around if this cooling effect were significant? Catastrophic global warming relies upon the hypothetical 2.5 multiplier of CO2. By looking at historical temperatures, we find that the maths doesn't add up, and thus the existence of this positive feedback is tenuous at best. Global warming theory predicts a tropical hotspot of warming 10 kilometers above the surface, the altitude of most clouds. However, the observed temperatures in the atmosphere over a 25-year period were significantly lower. Not only was there no hotspot in the skies, but also the models never predicted the last 10 years of global cooling. It's true to say that 25 years is a relatively short time when it comes to climate change, and the complex plethora of forces that drive temperature can mask each other. Maybe there is global sulfate cooling masking an overall upward temperature trend. Perhaps, but unlikely. Climate models, the main evidence for global warming, have not had much luck in predicting temperatures thus far, and must currently be approached with caution. Climate models claim CO2 is a powerful driver of temperature. What does the historical record say? As you delve further into the past, data quality deteriorates. However, the generally accepted correlation between CO2 and temperature over the past 600 million years paints an interesting picture of how our planet has a large variability in atmospheric conditions, but rarely catastrophic to life. Fossil fuel burning has perhaps led to the highest atmospheric CO2 concentration in 600,000 years, 380 parts per million. But is this abnormal? Is this a cause for concern? Probably not. For a long-term perspective, we are currently in a relative cool phase with very low CO2. However, life is used to warmer conditions with much higher CO2 levels. Not only is 380 parts per million a relatively low level, but the correlation between CO2 and temperature is relatively weak in the long term. For instance, in the Ice Age 450 million years ago, CO2 was not low as expected by some, but actually 15 times higher than now. Once you put things into historical perspective, the prospective seems a lot rosier. In the third IPCC report, Michael Mann put forward the famous hockey stick graph. This graph created great ripples within the global community, was often cited and used to demonstrate that catastrophic global warming was on the horizon. He claimed the last half-century was the warmest in 1300 years and was not within natural variation. However, his data source, tree rings of bristlecone pines, has been largely discredited since. He used comparative tree ring widths as a proxy for global temperature. Firstly, this is a single localized dataset. Secondly, and perhaps more significantly, tree rings are only very poorly correlated to temperature. More often than not, the limiting factor to plant growth is water availability, not temperature. And with the bristlecone pines, this is particularly true. The pines' evidence has been thoroughly chipped away. Does that imply that the concept of catastrophic global warming should be also? If you want to find out how temperatures varied over the past few thousand years, you need go no further than a study like Lowell's in 2007. His results have been replicated many times over, and he himself used 18 different globally distributed datasets which tightly agreed with each other. This gives us a large confidence in his findings which agree with all the anecdotal evidence we have as well. Instead of a flat line of low temperature, as proposed by Michael Mann over the past millennium, there have been significant changes. During the medieval warm period, Vikings under Eric the Red were able to colonize a green and fertile land, Greenland. "500 years later, they were completely driven out by the worsening cold of the Little Ice Age. This cold spell ended in the early 1800s, so did the annual London Frost Fairs, as the world began warming, as it has ever since. So, today is not particularly warm. It's still cooler than the Middle Ages, and in addition, and perhaps most importantly, the current warming predates any industrialization by a few hundred years. Since the Industrial Revolution, both temperature and CO2 have risen somewhat, true. But by looking at the past 1,000 years or so, we can see that this temperature change is within natural variation and a continuance of a trend that began 200 years before man started churning out the CO2. If you look more closely at just the past 100 years, the correlation between temperature and CO2 is not as close as one may think. Much of the 0.6 degrees of warming occurred in the first half of the 20th century, but CO2 emissions were still minor then. During the post-war boom of the 40s to the 50s, when you would have expected significant global warming due to CO2, the reverse happened. Temperatures dropped. You could say that there were other extraneous factors that led to this discontinuity in global warming. Some claim sulfate cooling, but this is largely discredited and no other factors have been proposed. So, man-made CO2 output does not appear to correlate well to temperature over the past century. By all accounts, whether it be surface stations, satellites, or by balloons, global warming has stopped over the past decade. There has been global warming for the past century, but its growth has stalled since 1998 in the face of the highest ever output of CO2. Some would say that this is just a natural variation masking the prevailing CO2 effect, and it is too soon to read anything into it. However, many skeptics would perhaps suggest that this downturn is perfectly explicable and demonstrates where the real driving force of the global climate is. It is the result of the combined forces of the well-documented alternative drivers of global temperature, the sun and the sea. The current cooling is perhaps due both to the oceans going into a well-predicted cooling phase, for example La Niña arriving in the Pacific, and due to ultra-low sunspot activity. In the face of the highest man-made CO2 output in history, global temperatures have dropped over the last decade, not risen as predicted by the climate models. Whether this is a temporary blip or not, none of the climate models relied on by the IPCC forecast this.
The ice is becoming too weak to support a male polar bear. Each year, as the climate warms, the Arctic holds less ice. This is a disaster for polar bears. Without its solid platform, they can't hunt the seals they need in order to survive. This may be a glimpse of the unstable future faced by this magnificent creature.
We are constantly being confronted with disturbing images of Mother Nature in strife, such as drowning polar bears. However, many studies show that these natural disasters are simply not happening. If anything, the planet is becoming less stormy, more fertile, and more habitable for both plants and animals. And by the way, polar bear populations are rising. Is the planet in strife? Is Mother Nature warning us that we are mishandling her and setting her on a course of catastrophic climate change? Most people agree that we could always do a better job of managing our environment. However, the question we pose here is whether CO2 production is leading to environmental disaster. There is very little evidence that the current warming trend has adversely affected the planet's environment. Quite the contrary, in fact. Despite the spiel often spun to us that there are more hurricanes, more floods, and more droughts of biblical proportions on their way, warming is good, cooling is bad. The continuous and stable warming of the last 300 years is saving lives and making us more prosperous. Let's look at the evidence. For the past 100 years, has there been a rise in hurricanes? No. More droughts? No. More melting glaciers? Yes, but this started well before man's industrialization, and thus is natural, not man-made. Likewise, has there been melting of the North Pole ice? Yes, but this trend is also pre-industrial, therefore also natural. In addition, the South Pole is actually expanding. If the current warming trend continues the next 200 years, the sea will only rise by 1 foot. Hardly cause for a concern. The planet is not crying out for help. It is a massive ecosystem that is not only weathering man quite well indeed, but actually positively prospering. Climate modeling is the future, not the present. One day we'll have a model that will encapsulate all the fundamental processes that make up our environment. Even then, due to the intrinsic chaos of this dynamic system, we would probably be only able to predict to a certain confidence level the weather. CO2 is the flavor of the month, but in many ways it's hard to justify as the dominant force driving our climate. We just don't have substantial evidence supporting it. Until we do, can we explain, at least qualitatively, the major drivers that are leading to the current global warming? Fortunately, the answer is yes, and these forces, unlike CO2, do have substantial amounts of evidence supporting them. But what are these possible forces? Plants absorb CO2, ice reflects sunlight, greenhouse gases absorb sunlight, and clouds both absorb and reflect sunlight. These all influence the greenhouse effect, and thus temperature, but are they the primary drivers of Earth's climate? What really feeds the system its energy? The sun and the sea. In particular, we could be really looking at the cycles of sunspots, which are flares of intense magnetic activity, and the ocean currents. is likely that global temperature is controlled by solar energy and then modulated by that phenomenal sump of energy that is the world's oceans. The solar and oceanic cycles sometimes offset and sometimes complement each other. The many other influences, such as man-made CO2, are relatively minor and often offset each other. There are substantial amounts of evidence showing correlations between both sunspot activity and oceanic cycles with global temperature. However, how do these climate forcings stand up as an alternative explanation of the current global warming? In this graph, we have both sunspot activity and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, a significant oceanic current, also known as the PDO, plotted against resultant global temperature. Is there a correlation and perhaps even causality? Over the last century, whenever both the sun is active and the PDO is in a warm phase, such as pre-World War II, then there has been significant global warming. However, at times, these forces have conflicted, such as in the post-war era of the 50s, and they can largely cancel each other out. This results in a rather stable temperature. More recently, in just the last 10 years, the sun has been fairly active, but was neutralized by the PDO turning to a cool phase. This stalled any further warming and perhaps could be seen as a slight cooling. Most importantly, whilst the sun and sea hypothesis accounts for recent temperatures accurately, the climate models did not. Thus, looking at the evidence, it's plausible that while sunspot activity is the primary driver of temperature over the last 300 years of global warming, the oceans have acted as a modulator of this overall trend, flexing it in the short term. Now, CO2 does matter. It does have a greenhouse effect, and warming from it is real. It is not totally being discounted. However, without the unsubstantiated 2.5 times multiplier, CO2-driven global warming is relatively small. The bulk of the global warming we've seen for the past 3 centuries can be readily explained by the sun's activity. Recent man-made CO2 is just a thin cream on the top. The very low solar activity of the 1600s, known as the Maunder Minimum, wiped out Viking civilization in Greenland. The next period of inactivity, the Dalton Minimum of the early 1800s, was characterized by the London frost fairs. Since then, the global weather has warmed and likewise the sunspot activity risen. Coincidence? The correlation between sunspots and temperature has long been recognized and has stood the test of time. As far back as 1801, William Herschel noted an apparent connection between wheat prices and sunspot records. The evidence for sunspots being a primary driver in climate change is considerable. So why have we suddenly put the finger of blame on CO2? It's the sunspots. Give credit where credit is due. It is possible, though far from proven, that man-made CO2 could trigger a tipping point that could send temperature catastrophically out of control. However, as for our current global warming, there are somewhat more convincing, substantiated drivers, primarily sunspots and also the oceans. The current gentle warming they drive is far from catastrophic. It is beneficial. So far, we have cited where possible the least controversial, most universally acceptable datasets. Global warming is a hot topic and controversy is always going to exist, but we've tried to concentrate on using non-biased, middle-of-the-road data. For example, we use the IPCC's version of the CO2 record, which shows the 200-year exponential rise in CO2. For the sake of argument, we have accepted this as fact.
Let me explain.
We have debated the issues using their data, but shedding an alternative light on the possible conclusions. Let's take one step back and hopefully, without muddying the waters too much, question 2 of the fundamental data sets, which are the foundation of the IPCC's argument: the temperature and the CO2 records.
All the records will show it.
The IPCC CO2 record of the past 2 centuries is made up of 2 parts: low-quality ice core samples up until 1957, and high-quality infrared spectroscopy thereafter. Why have they used these ice core samples when at best they can give a rolling 20-year average? Well, if that's all we had to work off, then fair enough. However, that is not the case. We have at hand highly accurate data derived from chemical methods carried out by many international groups, some decorated with Nobel Prizes. Why has this massive body of top-quality work been ignored? Well, by looking at the difference in results, the answer may become apparent. Ice core data corroborates with CO2-driven global warming. We've been churning out masses of CO2 since World War II. But according to high-quality records, the CO2 in the atmosphere has actually dropped slightly. Today's so-called dangerous level of 380 parts per million is significantly lower than 1940 and 1820. This noticeably contradicts global warming theory. In addition, CO2 changes lag temperature by 5 years. How can this be possible? Well, it is if you assume that temperature drives CO2, not the other way around. The well-known mechanism is as follows. Oceans contain the vast majority of the planet's CO2. By varying temperature, you slowly vary the amount it can hold, and thus the amount that resides in the atmosphere. The IPCC have ignored the existence of 200 years of high-quality CO2 measurements. These clearly show that CO2 is naturally highly variable and also that it lags temperature. CO2 is not the driver, but the driven. The IPCC championed the surface temperature record over that of satellites and balloons which monitor atmospheric temperatures. It is true that there is a great debate that rages over the comparative merits of the 3 data methodologies. Satellites have only a continuous record since '79, and balloons have non-standard instrumentation, but combined they give a corroborating, unpolluted and global record since '58. The surface temperature record goes back to the late 1800s, but is far from clean. The number of stations has declined significantly over the years, and the quality is often questionable. Many stations are polluted by the local environment, for example, near runway tarmacs, or as we can see here, next to a trash burn barrel. In addition, many sites which were unspoilt and greenfield 100 years ago are now built up and within cities. Buildings retain heat and artificially raise the local temperature beyond natural background levels. This urban heat island effect has been declared negligible by the IPCC, but many others claim it has exaggerated official temperatures by as much as 20%. The urban heat island effect is very well documented and suggests that there is an exaggeration in the global temperature record. But the IPCC choose to ignore this. After all, it does prop up global warming theory. With that said, even if the record is inflated by 20%, there still is global warming. That is not being questioned here. What is questioned, though, is that it is not as large as they say, and it's been rising for 300 years, well before industrialization. So, it is likely that global warming is largely due to natural variation and very little to do with CO2 production. The beauty of science is that it's rarely black and white. It's often shades of grey, and we end up believing a theory because the weight of probability agrees with it. So let's look at some of the claims of man-made CO2 being the primary driver of the current global warming. It is true that CO2 correlates quite well to temperature, but it lags by 800 years, which would suggest that it is effect rather than cause. Some say this lag is irrelevant because it's the positive feedback on the temperature that makes it a global forcing. This also may be true, but there is very little physical evidence to this effect. An important telltale sign of greenhouse gas-driven global warming was the expectation of hotspots in the tropical troposphere. However, over the past 25 years, they haven't been convincingly observed. We are allegedly set on a course for catastrophic global warming. This assumes that the last 50 years were the warmest in the last 1300, and is not within natural variability. However, as we've seen, not only are we not in the 50 warmest years, but also our current warming trend is remarkable in its unremarkableness. It fits easily within natural variability. Climate models, derived from historic data and assumptions on physical behaviors, claim to predict catastrophic global warming. However, their backtesting track record is questionable. Their positive feedback mechanism requires a warming in the last century of 1.4 degrees, but only 0.6 degrees was actually observed. In addition, their predictions thus far have missed the mark. They predicted continuous global warming when the last 10 years actually cooled. Considering this, can we say CO2 is the main driver of global warming? Well, yes, never say never, but the chances do seem a tad slim. The evidence is thin on the ground. Some organizations, such as the influential IPCC, would say that the issue is done and dusted, all over Red Rover. CO2 is driving global warming, the science is settled.
People who believe that human beings are not responsible, they would at some stage become part of history like the Flat Earth Society.
Others, like the 700 top scientists who put their names on the dotted line and signed a US Senate minority report saying they were skeptical, would perhaps of course disagree. So, for argument's sake, let's assume both parties do exist, the science is thus not settled, and there is no consensus. Even if all the science is phony, won't the collateral environmental benefits that emissions limiting legislation creates be an overall benefit for us anyway? So forget the science. What are the good, the bad, and the ugly ramifications of climate change for us? What are the social, political, and economic costs? Will climate change legislation make our lives better? President Obama successfully got his emissions trading scheme through the House of Representatives with the rallying cry, remember these 4 words, jobs, 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 and jobs.
That could create millions of new jobs in America, jobs that can't be shipped overseas.
Previously in 2007, he did also state his other main motive,
will reduce our dependence on foreign oil.
President Obama's second point regarding energy security, which harkens back to Maggie Thatcher's original motive when she set the wheels in motion for the inauguration of the IPCC, is very sensible.
The miners resisted, and the police moved forward en masse in a manoeuvre well tried and tested. During the struggles which followed, one policeman was hit on the head by a stone.
Energy security is very important. In addition, fossil fuels are finite. Burning them for energy instead of using them in manufacturing does seem a waste if it were avoidable. But is the net effect of climate change legislation a benefit to mankind? Is it really a great opportunity to create jobs? Well, whether you believe that CO2 is destroying our planet or not, why don't we do the sensible thing and minimize the risk? Isn't it better to be safe than sorry? True, this precautionary principle, as it is called, is often a prudent way to go about things. However, what if the cost of the precaution actually outweighs the risk? And, in addition, what if this cost is not only prohibitively large, but also virtually ineffective anyway? Similarly, why would you buy a car, then pay an insurance premium on it that is greater than the car's actual worth? To top it off, this overpriced premium would only cover the replacement of a wing mirror when you accidentally total the whole car. In many ways, bizarrely, both sides of the argument admit to this. In Australia, for example, both the Conservative parties and the Greens are in an unusual agreement. Both say no to the emissions trading scheme. The Conservatives believe that the scheme will, especially mid-credit crunch, cripple the economy with only very minor resultant CO2 reductions. For that very same reason, the Greens won't vote for a scheme with only very minor reductions, as they say this is not enough.
G'day Australia, here's what's happening. Kevin Rudd wants us to pass a bill which sets targets way too low to stop climate change. He's locking in failure. He wants you to believe that the only choice is between his bill and no bill at all. That's bunkum.
It's only the socialists in the middle who are voting for the feel-good, but rather damaging and somewhat ineffective scheme. So what are the costs of CO2 reduction? The important campaign slogan for President Obama to pass the US emissions scheme is green jobs. This scheme will come in the popular cap and trade guise. This means cap overall CO2 emissions, then trade excess quotas to the highest bidder. Thus, the inefficient companies essentially subsidize the efficient. This may sound all well and good in theory, but what are the emissions schemes? They're taxes, plain and simple. We're not talking about a small, marginal tax. The US, among other developed countries, is proposing the largest tax in its history, greater than that to fund World War II. That's $300 billion US a year. President Obama has been trying to promote the green jobs benefit and downplaying the associated cost. As he says himself,
under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket.
We in the West can hardly afford this. However, in the developing countries, this is simply out of the question. Without cheap energy, they can't fight their way out of poverty. The EU have had an emissions scheme running since 2005, and it has had its fair share of criticism. Studies say for that every green job created in Spain, for example, 2.2 are lost, and each of these jobs costed 1 million to create.
Because in Spain what the politicians have done is to create a renewable bubble, and every year in order to maintain the bubble there they have to put more and more millions or more billions into the bubble.
Jobs created out of taxes are generally jobs not worth having. They are inefficient and often unnecessary. There was a very good reason the 100% employment policy of communism led to ultimate economic collapse. It doesn't work. You can't make something out of nothing.
And Spain's unemployment rate is currently the highest in Europe.
To really minimize emissions and improve energy efficiency, we need innovation. And innovation needs a stable, free economy. Emissions trading schemes are massive tax schemes that empower governments to the detriment of their very own citizens. They could very well create social democratic states that are intrinsically inefficient and invariably stifle their economies. Somewhat counterproductively, some of the currently implemented CO2 reducing policies are actually increasing CO2. Biofuels, such as those derived from palm oil and sugarcane, are meant to be grown to reduce petrol use in cars. This sounds all well and good in principle, but this procedure leads to essential food crops being replaced with cash crops. This in turn leads to the destruction of the rainforest, as land is cleared both for the biofuel cash crop and for food. Destruction of the rainforest leads to release of CO2 and damages local self-sustainability.
The virgin rainforest of Borneo, it has stood for thousands of years. But it's being destroyed at a rate said to be unparalleled in human history. It's disappearing under a two-pronged onslaught from logging and the proliferation of palm oil plantations.
In addition, emissions trading will damage industry in many ways. Carbon-dependent industries, such as power generators, aluminium smelters, and the mining companies will be particularly affected. It will heavily tax them, create market uncertainty, and thus also devalue them further. This devaluation will drop their credit ratings and likely make them go either bankrupt or at least overseas. Countries like India and China have stated many times that they will not match US environmental goals in order to protect their own economies. They would thus be the beneficiaries of our outsourcing loss. If Australia goes ahead with its emissions trading scheme, it would spend about 50 billion Australian dollars by 2020. This would lead to an inconsequential 10% cut in Australian emissions.
All of the activities about mitigating carbon dioxide, which is not a pollutant, are pointless, very expensive, and completely ineffective.
So with so high a cost and so little a benefit, does the precautionary principle of better safe than sorry seem a viable option? Even if you believe in man-made global warming, are phenomenally expensive schemes to reduce CO2 emissions the best way to deal with it?
Within these last 19 months, at least 45 satellites have circled the Earth. Tyrus satellites have given us unprecedented warnings of hurricanes and storms, and will do the same for forest fires and icebergs.
The beauty of man is our adaptability. Where there is a will, there is often a way. Energy production is the foundation of modern civilization. Without cheap energy, we can kiss our prosperous lifestyles goodbye. So with all this ingenuity, perhaps we should be able to kick old school, dirty coal and oil out the door. It's time to herald in a cleaner, greener world powered by wind and by solar. Our human ingenuity will no doubt give us limitless green energy one day. But that day is not today. Renewable alternatives to fossil fuel burning are not yet available. There are no cheap technologies to replace coal. Nuclear could do the job, and it's high time we pulled our heads out of the sand, don't believe the hype, and actually consider it seriously. It seems to me that if A, you believe in man-made global warming, and B, you want to tackle it seriously, you really should be embracing nuclear power. However, I digress. The point is, renewables can't replace coal. Coal is not only very cheap, but also extremely reliable. Solar needs the sun, wind needs the wind, and whilst coal can run 24/7, they only run intermittently. As for clean coal, it's a great concept, but presently just a pipe dream. It won't realistically be on the horizon for decades to come. If there were cleaner, greener, and at least barely economic alternatives to coal, we would use them in a flash. Unfortunately, they haven't been invented yet. So for the foreseeable future, coal will be there making our lives better until a viable alternative is invented to perhaps replace it. The global warming debate, like its subject matter, the globe, is a hugely complex affair. But here are a few take-home points that may be food for thought when considering whether man-made CO2 is a serious problem or not. Global warming did not start in the last century, as we're often told, but hundreds of years earlier, before any industrialization. CO2 is thus very unlikely the driver of warming. The obvious cause of this warming is also the probable one. It's the sun, with the added effect of the oceans, not CO2. Warming is good, by the way, not bad as the press may lead you to believe. Warming feeds the planet and aids biodiversity. Science revolves around hypotheses and supporting evidence. When it comes to CO2, there is very little of that. $50 billion American dollars have been spent since the 90s looking for CO2 warming, without hardly any success. The argument for it largely centers on non-transparent, rarely published climate models. These models have neither backtested to historical data very well, nor predicted the last 10 years of cooling. They blame CO2, but can we really trust them? They will, no doubt, improve in time, but currently they must be taken with a large pinch of salt. It is often better to be safe than sorry. So why don't we take precautions against the chance that CO2 is the problem? However, the costs are so great that it will kill the world's poor and cripple the Western economies with very little temperature reduction. CO2 gets such a bad name, unjustly so. It is not a pollutant at all. It is actually a vital element of the atmosphere, and an important fertilizer that has improved global crop yields by 15% since the 50s. Surely we should be producing more, not less of it. The Church of Global Warming is about faith, not debate. Unquestioning faith in man-made, CO2-driven global warming. Well, it should not be a matter of faith, but of open debate. Currently, the debate is slowly rising to the fore, which is certainly a good thing, as the social and economic impact of global warming prevention is massive. Naturally, many people are now ambivalent towards the global warming debate, a natural and reasonable apathy that comes from media overexposure. However, if pressed, many people would show concern for the topic. Is the planet dying? Can I do something about it? The fact that we are in a global credit crunch and people's livelihoods are being pulled out from under them as we speak has really taken the focus away from global warming. This is a long-term, somewhat intangible concept, thus not as immediately important to us. However, our politicians are still set on a course to further cripple our economies with anti-global warming emissions trading schemes.
Electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket.
Is this wise in a climate of economic recession? Well, if we are destroying our planet, probably yes, as this takes precedence over our current economic crisis. But if CO2 isn't a problem, which is the far more likely situation, stop now. Spend our money on improving lives, not harming them. There is no catastrophic global warming on the foreseeable horizon. Invest in green technologies? Absolutely. Reduce our reliance on fossil fuels? Definitely. But don't cripple the world's economy with massive carbon taxes based on unsubstantiated science. Promote free trade and thus aid universal economic growth. This development is the real way we can not only improve all our lives, but also, somewhat ironically, ultimately obtain our common goal of minimizing our impact on the planet.